QSO Today, episode 452, George Heron, N2APB. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. My life is joyfully complicated this week with holidays in Israel and my concert on Tuesday night, where I am the producer, promoter, and one of the musicians on stage. So I am bringing to you a best-of interview from June 2017 with George Heron, N2APB. The audio has been remastered for better sound and quality. George Heron, N2APB, loves the design, collaboration, and building of electronic devices for amateur radio, along with his friend and mentor, Joe Everhart, N2CX, now a silent key. Together, they shared their discoveries live on their Chat with the Designers podcast. Every aspect of amateur radio interests George, from test equipment and restored vintage radios to standalone SDR transceivers and more efficient designs of magnetic loop antennas. N2APB is my QSO Today. N2APB, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, George?
Hello, Eric. This is George. How are you?
I'm great, George. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, like many, I became interested in electronics back in high school. And this was like in the late 60s. And by the end of my high school period of time, I was a ham. I had a novice license then. My Elmer took me over that hurdle, and ever since then, it's been really great.
How old were you when you got your novice license, and what was the call sign?
I think I was about 18, maybe 17, and I was WN2WVZ, which is a mouthful these days.
It sounds like a great CW call sign as well.
Yeah, it could be.
And what year was that?
I believe it was in 1969.
Do you remember the names of the Elmers that helped you?
Well, one of my friends in high school, his dad had a great station, and my friend and I shared electronics interests there in school. And he brought me over to his house one day while I was down in his dad's shack, and it was just amazing. It was like I had discovered Oz, and all of the different equipment, and actually being able to communicate. And I fell in love with Morse code. And I've forgotten his call sign. His name was Robert Dittmeyer, I think, or Dittwire. And he just had me coming back time after time and working on the code and letting me listen and transmit under his guidance and just kind of getting my feet wet, which really served well. So that's really what sparked the interest.
Do you remember your first rig?
Oh, it was homebrew, one of the 40-meter open chassis, 2-tube, 10-watt transmitters out of QST. I forgot the exact design, but I had seen something like that in my Elmer's shack. And he had directed me to go throughout the neighborhood and collect old TVs, as we did back in those days. They were out on the street for garbage collection. And I was in a regular habit then of bringing back TVs to my dad's, to my basement and taking them apart and clipping all the resistors and capacitors and tubes and getting the tube sockets out and then amassing quite a collection of stuff. We didn't have a lot of money back then, so it was always just building my own things and out of the scrap parts that we had there. But that's one of the fondest memories that I have of those times in regards to the hobby.
What kind of receiver did you have?
That's a hard thing to homebrew, of course. My dad eventually got me a a Star Roamer. I forgot the specific model, but it might have been just the Star Roamer. And although it's not the exact same one, over the years I found one that was in good shape, and I restored it, and it's sitting on my bench. And I really look back at it with a lot of nostalgia. I don't use it that much. It's not a great performer, of course, but it brings back those memories. And it's just next to, again, that actually it's an AC-1 now that I kind of use in some of the straight key nights and when I want to go back to the old novice day memories.
So you use an AC-1 as a transmitter now?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very cool. That was a kit transmitter, as I recall. Echo kits?
Yeah, it might have been something like Echo. Yeah, it was. I didn't build it up. I think it was given to me eventually by my Elmer when he started dismantling his own shack, and I went off to college.
So when you got that whole homebrew two-tube transmitter together and you made your first contact, what did that feel like? And do you remember who you spoke to or who you did a CWQSO with?
I don't remember who, but it was, I don't know, somebody from California. So I'm located on the East Coast here in the U.S., and going all the way across the country was like a really big thing. And I had made contacts under the guidance of my Elmer using his station, but the very first time that I made a contact from my own home, my parents' home, back in Tonawanda, New York, it was like a thrill that you don't forget.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
I think it did. It's hard to distinguish. One has interests eventually that ultimately get cultivated and work in the selection of where you go to college, what kind of a program that you follow. And I was following electrical engineering. So ham radio kind of fed that interest and reinforced that interest. And then likewise, my early interest and then the early training from my school really fed back into my hobby, which strengthened and grew a lot of my abilities back then. So it was a very symbiotic type of relationship that, heck, it stayed with me throughout all of the years.
Now you got an EE. Where'd you get it from?
I went to Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York. Snowy and cloudy Rochester, New York.
I think we've had some other QSO Today guests who've also went there.
Oh, well, I might
have to look that up.
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
There's a picture of your ham station in QRZ, and it appears that you really like old gear, including the Heathkit replica. I thought of your novice station, but it could have been, someone else's novice station. Well, what is the appeal of old equipment?
That's a great question, especially I get that question a lot these days because everybody, and even my own Elmer these days, my good friend, N2CX, is chiding me for my interest in tubes and high voltage and quote-unquote low performance that the older rigs had. For me, it's not just the nostalgia aspect of communication, building and using communications equipment from the old days. When I matured as an electrical engineer and really kind of came into my own back in the like 1975, for example, the tube days were essentially gone from ham radio. At least the, let's call the transistors were really on the forefront back then. Early 70s is when the transistorized equipment really started coming about. And that's when I adopted the hobby. And even though I built my AC, I built an equivalent of the AC-1 when I started, I quickly got in line with all of the other leading edge stuff. And I had transistorized equipment going forward. Back in the, after maybe 10 or 15 years, I started looking back at the older equipment and pre-transistors and trying to understand the design practices and principles. I'm a designer at heart, so I'm much more into the building and analyzing of equipment as opposed to operating in our hobby, although I do like to operate as well. So looking back at the old tube designs, it was so different than my training, than my evolution within the hobby up to that point. It just was really attractive. And that's when I first started getting back into collecting, starting to grab onto older equipment, making it work, bringing it back to life, if you will, is a great thrill for me. But also understanding its design practices and principles. Today, just as an example, there are several books around hollow state design. I forgot the author at the moment, but it greatly exemplifies the path that designers ultimately took, or that one takes when designing tube equipment, tube-based amplifiers, tube-based power supplies, tube-based detectors, modulators, things of that nature. Our hams today mostly don't know about that, and that's okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but I find that understanding the technology enough to be able to implement some of these basic building blocks that we have today within our radios and within the hobby overall is it's a thrill to be able to do that back with the older tubes. And to me, a radio really, I like having knobs and big indicators, and as I get older, it's easier to see and operate some of the bigger rigs as opposed to a smaller rig with a small LCD, one button that selects 59 different menu items in the palm of your hand. So, I mean, it's all a matter of preference, and I like them both, as we'll probably chat about a little bit too, is my interest in the DSP design activities for radios. But I think my heart really lies with the old boat anchors, as we say.
The book Hollow State Design was written by Grayson Evans, KJ7UM, right? He was also at FDIM.
I know. I met him, I shook his hand, we chatted for a bit, and it was a great pleasure.
But he was a guest in episode 86 of the QSO Today podcast. I'll put a link to that on your show notes page. When you find an old piece of gear, do you have a process to restore that piece of gear?
Well, sometimes it's serendipitous relative to what you find and what you ultimately take forward. I don't follow anything different than what the guidance is. And Electric Radio is a great magazine that I highly prize my subscription to that. And over the years, that plus other magazines and online references describe the process of bringing up an old rig, taking it apart, cleaning it, restoring the front panel. I don't try to restore to the absolute original state. I mean, that's something that could be done, but I'd rather bring it forward to the point where it looks like maybe what you see on my QRZ page. But I'd like to operate it, and it's not going to sit on my shelf. If there are things sitting on my shelf that are not working, it's only as a visual reminder to me that I've got to get it done and get it working. But to that end, I've got another room outside my lab, as I say, right here in my shack. That other room is just filled with a lot of old radios that are queued up, waiting for my retirement and waiting for me to have a little bit more time to be spending in line. And I've spent a lot of time going through that queue of radios and saying, okay, I'm really going to get to do this one. I've got an old HR-50 that I'm anxious to get to, but there's just no time and no room in the shack right now for that. But bringing them back to the original, or close to the original performance, is probably my primary goal. The better shape it's in to start with, so much the better. It's all a matter of what you find.
In this vein, how have you made time to do rig restoration and the other things we'll talk about, and ham radio at the same time, and work?
Well, I think with each of us, it's a matter of you find time to do the things that you like. My wife would say that's the case too, because there are other things around the house that maybe other guys do here in the neighborhood that I'm not as much into. Maybe it's gardening, maybe it's putting up a deck in the backyard or whatever. But the things that I enjoy doing, and my family supports me in that, is working with the radios and tinkering and making things. I think at my heart, I'm a maker, probably in the true sense of the current term, maker hobby, if you will. But I like to build things and make them work, whether it's, make it work again, as with the old boat anchors, or if there's a new design and some new ideas that I or my design buddies come up with, and we collaborate and ultimately produce a new gadget. I mean, that's the thing that gives me the thrill. So I find the time for that. And you just fit it in with other, with the work, which is the 8 or more hours a day. And of course, the family needs. My family's a little bit mature now, so that gets me a little bit more time down here in the shack. And it's life is a balance, as they say.
You have your own podcast with Joe. The guy that you just mentioned was your Elmer, Joe N2CX, called Chat with the Designers. How did this start out?
Well, Joe and I go way back. We started with together with the New Jersey QRP Club, and we've been up until recently we've been co-leaders of that, for 20 years. And again, carrying forth the principles that I sort of brushed on a moment ago, making things and small projects that illustrate principles, that making gadgets that you can use on your bench or your shack, or your rig, making things that can measure. These are all thrills that Joe shares with me, interests that he shares with me. So we really hit it off well, and ultimately through the years really put on sponsored a lot of projects with the the New Jersey QRP Club, which then evolved into the American QRP Club, AMQRP, kind of along the lines of NorCal, along the lines of four-state QRP, and the many other QRP clubs that have projects and sponsor little kits. Well, the interest in those kits and the projects and the ideas, and Joe and I have kind of a banter that we, over the years, have developed, and we really feed off of each other. And whether it's subtle jokes that one would understand if you're in the hobby or if you're in the technology or just within a society scene, you would pick it up, and it's kind of interesting. So we found that if we just shared our conversation with others and actually asked them to participate along the way, that might be kind of an interesting forum. We tried it out live at some Atlanticon forums, and of course at our monthly QRP meetings, which were very atypical. They were very hands-on, very topic-oriented, no rules, no agenda per se. So it was kind of interesting to those who would come together in the, I guess probably easiest is in the Princeton area of New Jersey for a long time. So we would have these conversations and draw people in, and then it dawned on us that with some of the conferencing capabilities that really became prominent in recent years, we started Chat with the Designers, I think back in 2009, maybe 2010. So for the last 7 years on an aperiodic, but sometimes it's monthly basis, sometimes it's every other month. We're on a little bit of a hiatus right now due to health reasons, but we're coming on the air again shortly. We decided to use TeamSpeak as the broad conferencing capabilities that we have. So Joe and I would get on the TeamSpeak and chat about project. And then we would invite others just through announcements on other lists and such to, hey, come join us, sign on to TeamSpeak and have, either listen and preferably to toss in your comments along the way, much as you would during a live in-person radio club meeting. So that's kind of how it started off. And then we developed a way to, over a period of time, to kind of hone that angle, that theme, that approach by having a website, a web page, and we called it a whiteboard because it was a web page whiteboard that we produced, that we added material to talking points material. So it's sort of like having a whiteboard at a meeting, like a chalkboard or an easel with a pad of paper that you could draw diagrams on and show what a mixer is and show, an antenna diagram or something like that. And then, so now we've got the voice with the TeamSpeak and the two-way interaction for those who wish to participate, and many did. We've got the whiteboard, and I was able to dynamically, although not super real time, but still I could update it with additional information if somebody had an idea. Hey, what about, what if I use this kind of a diode mixer instead of instead of this ADE1 balanced modulator chip. What if I did it piecemeal? How would that look? Well, I would throw that little diagram, the 4-diode diagram, up on the whiteboard, and everybody would be able to see it. And that was working out really well. And over the episodes, I forgot how many we have. We're close to 100. And we have a lot of material in these whiteboards. And then, of course, as you alluded when we started, the idea dawned on us hey, we could record this audio as well in the form of a podcast. So limiting the conversation to probably an hour to an hour and a quarter, hour and 20 minutes. We produced a podcast that could be listened to while somebody was driving to work over in Germany in the mornings, or sitting on a beach in Jamaica, as hams sometimes do, and listen to the material that kind of interest to them. And we covered a broad range of topics, ranging from principles of radio, principles of antenna systems, and how does it's not just the superficial stuff, but a little bit deeper, which we were hoping to draw in additional people and help strengthen their own base of knowledge.
Well, one of the things I'm looking right now at your VCXO voltage-controlled crystal oscillator it's under the article GPS Disciplined Oscillator on your website. You've got amazing documentation, and you've done something that's I think is very interesting. Is that you show the product in actual pieces, but then you've left boxes, phase 2, phase 3, to expand the project. Are you doing all of these labels and all of this schematic capture and all that stuff as part of this, or do you farm that off to somebody else?
Oh no, that's me, Joe and me. We do it all. I mean, it's all kind of like what we do to document our projects normally. So whether we do it for ourselves, and documenting your operating bench, all your radios connected to each other and whatnot, we're just doing it for the projects here that we're working with the people there on TeamSpeak. So it's we're using common tools, PowerPoint. We also use Visio. It's a little bit easier there, and a very I'm still using Front Page, which is the web page editor to post all the material up onto a website. And we're just using the common tools and for diagrams and text. But the project that you explained there with the VCO and the different blocks for the GPS DO, Disciplined Oscillator, is a very current project. We're finishing off the final piece right now. So it's like one of the projects in a continuing series that we've been talking about and describing and evolving there on Chat with the Designers.
Well, you make it so easy to understand what the evolution of this project is, from its very beginning as just a crystal VCXO, and then adding the oven, and then adding the GPS. It makes so much sense, and it looks easy.
Well, that's kind of our goal, is to make
it look easy.
What we want, Eric, is for hams, kind of like an underlying goal that I have, an underlying mantra. I don't know what the right word is. What I really want is hams to understand the hobby, to get beyond the appliance user stage, and to understand the principles that everybody had to learn when they ultimately got their ham radio license. And that is, the basics of electronics. At our heart, all of us hams have an interest in frequency. I've thought a little bit about this, and it's kind of interesting to me at any rate. So it all comes down to frequency, whether you're sending that frequency out, whether you're receiving a frequency, whether you're generating with a VCXO or crystal oscillator, you're generating a frequency. Ultimately, you hear the frequencies on the radios that you use. So if we start at the very basics of, what is the frequency, how is it used, how is it generated, how is it detected, how is it radiated, and all the ancillary types of basic principles. Any ham, if they're interested in following along, will be able to strengthen their own knowledge of the hobby and make them better hams for it. I mean, there are many facets of interest in the hobby, of course. Our goal has been to help lead the hams to the watering hole for the technology part, and to strengthen that if they have the desire.
How do you decide on the content and projects that you do in chat with the designers?
It's a bit what we feel like doing at any given point in time. For example, we have an extensive episode or two on grounding. Now everybody knows you got to ground your station, you connect your equipment together, you drive a stake in the ground. Maybe some people think you need radials, and you do for verticals, at any rate. But we take each of those different aspects, and then we just kind of take it to the next level about, like, what really is good grounding? What does it mean to be safe during electric storms with all of our aluminum up in the air or wires in the air? And to your point, this came about because I was grounding my station. I was making a good grounding. I'd kind of transitioned to use of high power sometimes, not all the time, but just I like the ability. I like AM radio, the AM mode. And you need a little bit higher power with that than the QRP stations offer. So having a good grounding system is really important when you're operating with higher power especially. So I put in some very special grounding for my station, copper tubes, and going out and grounding it to a rod outside the basement, and putting out radials to enhance the conductivity of the ground and such. So that all was happening, and Joe and I said, geez, a lot of people might be kind of interested in this topic too. So then we developed over a week or two a little bit of content and material, as we normally do. We do the research and collect references, and then put on the episode that talked about grounding. And then, again, in the hopes that people would, and hams would say, gee, it's not really as hard as I thought, or I never understood why connecting equipment together and taking the shortest path to the main ground is important. Get them thinking about that. So when selecting topics for discussion and chat with the designers, it is more the common things that we hams are using and doing in the shack. If you look down the list of the programs, you would see that there are topics of grounding, the basics of resistors and capacitor selection, and temperature coefficients, tolerances. Oftentimes we take apart a design. We take a simple design. Maybe we take an Elecraft schematic for an XG2. I think that's the name of their multi-tones generator that's useful in calibrating and such. And we just kind of analyze it. In fact, we call it the Analyze This series of episodes. And by going through the design and just verbally back and forth, Joe and I would, hey, what about this oscillator? How does it work? What's its output impedance, Joe? And Joe would explain this. And Joe would toss another question back at me, and then I would explain another aspect of the design. So, Eric, it's probably selecting topics of basic interest to a wide audience of ham radio guys that would probably characterize the theme and the approach that we follow for chat with the designers.
What is Midnight Design Solutions then?
Well, again, coming back to the AM QRP days and the New Jersey QRP days, and we used to produce a lot of kits, that were small and easy for the guys to put together. And ultimately, it just became a lot to be asking individuals in the clubs to be producing and kitting up these projects. And there's a lot of effort that's required, and you have to be careful about the parts that you include and such. So ultimately, long story short, is that I took over that activity and kind of created a small second business that truly operated at midnight, hence the name Midnight Design. That became the kitting and productization arm of New Jersey QRP and the AM QRP kits. And this alleviated us from bending and twisting the same arms in the club over and over for how to put these kits together, which, of course, centralized all of that responsibility on me. So once again, I just was able to kind of fit that into my schedule, my activities. My wife and daughters help out a lot with that. And together we're able to get these kits out the door to guys who want to buy them at reasonable prices and have a good time putting them together. That's what Midnight Design is. It started off as, and then along the way, it became kind of a conduit for me with Joe. Joe is a collaborative designer with me in it. I have several other collaborative designers that we'll probably touch on along the way here. We would have an idea for a gadget, an instrument, a radio, an antenna, whatever. And again, Midnight Design became the vehicle for getting that out and to the ham population.
And now this mid-show break. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month, or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I'm now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSOTodayCommunity.com website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Commercial-free allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445 on, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think it is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I'm not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon anymore, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for the transcriptions. There is a new section where I list the most recent sponsors and donors over the last 30 days. This list is generated automatically from my membership system. This week's new sponsors are John Gruzel, KC9OJV, and Mark Steele, KD2NOM. There were anonymous donors as well, and we appreciate their contributions without mentioning them by name. Our funding model is now value for value, where you trade with me your time, talent, or treasure that you think values the benefit of the QSO Today podcast to you. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations that keep the lights burning here. Finally, you don't have to contribute anything to listen to the QSO Today podcast. You can use my Amazon affiliate link before shopping at Amazon by clicking on it on the right side of the show notes page. This will signal Amazon to send us a small percentage of what you purchase. This is the most painless way to ensure that QSO Today will be here next week. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now back to our QSO Today. On the front page of Midnight Design Solutions is the SDR Cube transceiver. What's the inspiration for that? And is there something unique about that transceiver that may be different from other transceiver designs in the marketplace?
Mm-hmm. Back in the probably in the 2000s, SDR became very much of interest to me with the onset of the soft rock technology, the soft rock projects from Tony Parks and others back in those days, creating many different versions of the soft rock, and you need a computer with that. Of course, it's the RF front end that produces the I and the Q quadrature components that are fed into a computer, the sound card, and then ultimately are decoded in order to display on a screen, and then of course pump audio out to the speaker, and voila, you've got your receiver. And turn it around, you've got a transmitter in the same manner. Joe and I have always been take it to the field. Field operations has been another underlying mantra of ours. Of course, being QRP guys at the core, we like to take our rigs out to the field. You can't take a computer that easily out to the field. Even laptops in the sun provide so much glare and there's not enough intensity to see it. So that kind of makes SDR, software-defined radio, a hard thing to do. So at the end of the day, what we really said was that, hey, we ought to be able to do this without a computer. And back in those days, back about 10, 15 years ago, only a handful, if any, were doing as SDR as a self-contained type of radio. So it was our goal back then, and we really have a bunch of prototypes back in those early days that we'd like to look back at and kind of chuckle at. We would take the soft rock and then have some onboard processing that would do the Hilbert transform and the other kinds of decoding or modulation in order to have SDR in the palm of your hand without the use of a classic laptop or worse, a desktop computer. In fact, kind of our mantra for this and also for the digital modem that I developed in partnership with another a good friend and design collaborator, W8NUE, we essentially said, we don't need no stinking computer, kind of a paraphrase of an older movie line that somebody did. And ultimately producing an SDR radio that didn't need a computer, a separate computer, or a PSK31 modem that didn't require a computer was really quite novel back then, and that was the genesis of those two particular products. Finding the right design partner to be working with, because there's just tons of work in producing these things, is very key. And I'm lucky to have a good bunch of friends to be able to do that with.
Is that product open source, would you say? Are people providing firmware upgrades and enhancements to that?
It is open source. The source is published, is available for download on our website. But I must say that not many people, unfortunately, because this was the driving factor for making it open source, we wanted people to take the source and to modify it and to add to it and add to the community have the community add to the feature pool to make it grow, as opposed to just, the original designers doing the whole thing. But not many people really did that. At best, some did, and changed some minor features or the display capability to put their own call sign on, and that's okay. But not as much as we thought. In a couple occasions, though, there were some that developed a bootloader, which was marvelous. I mean, that was a great addition to the SDR Cube transceiver, for example. One of our friends in Finland developed a great bootloader that ultimately we're still using today, and it's just it worked out nicely.
There's a picture of your test bench on your QRZ page, and it appears like you really like test equipment. So do I. For a ham starting out, what equipment should a minimalist ham have on his bench?
That's a good question. Obviously, and even as mundane as it might sound, is having a good multimeter is probably the very first thing that somebody has, and it's easy to build yourself a little RF probe to go onto your multimeter that will allow you to display, to measure and read RF energy. That's kind of, again, coming back to my frequency theme. At our heart, we're always measuring things having to do with frequencies. That's an essential first step. Being able to see the signal provides amazing insight to one's ability, when looking at it, signals a radio on the bench, or trying to make it work again, or just try to understand it. If you have an oscilloscope visually displays so much more information than you can see with just a multimeter, even considering DC voltage, for example. Multimeter reads DC volts, right? Easy. But if you put a DC signal on a scope, you can see a lot of other information, such as noise, such as changes, dynamic changes in that DC voltage. So the scope is a very essential piece.
So the minimalist ham has a multimeter and an oscilloscope. Is there anything else he should have?
Oh, obviously a power supply, some kind of a bench power supply, 12 volts, and have a little system for connecting the different power plugs for all your different radios. Most of our radios these days are using like a coaxial power connector, 2.1 millimeter plug. But there are some power poles these days, so having little adapters to be able to power anything up. And then your power supply would ideally have obviously a voltmeter, an adjustable voltmeter, adjustable power supply with a voltmeter, and also a current capability, a current limit capability, being able to set a maximum current at, say, 500 mils is a great feature to help you keep from frying some of your test circuits that you have there. For the minimalist, that's, I think, probably, I'm gazing at my bench right now, being able to measure a frequency, although you can do it with a scope just by, of course, determining the period of the waveform being displayed. It's also pretty handy to have a frequency counter. And you can get frequency counters really low cost these days on eBay, the internet. Single boards can be as inexpensive as $15. QRP Guys, I think, is one such place that offers them, but there are many places to get these things. It's not hard to collect a good enough set of test equipment to start up your bench. And I use the word good enough kind of interestingly. This is a pet phrase of Joe, N2CX. It's oftentimes you can do an overkill on measurement equipment. You can buy really expensive equipment to do the job, or you can have a multimeter in this case that might be good enough to give you the information that you need. So oftentimes we can buy good enough test and measurement equipment for low cost on the internet and different QRP clubs and such, and build it up yourself very inexpensively, and have yourself a good enough measurement and test station bench that would be, suffice for, working with your QRP rigs or building up some simple designs along with your soldering station and little parts bin that would constitute kind of a closet lab, if to visually kind of put it in perspective. It doesn't have to be very big, but just having some of the basics really helps you along.
If you were given an ultimatum by your wife that all the stuff has to go of your test equipment, which three pieces would you keep?
Oh, that's a funny question. My wife is great with me in the hobby, and she jokingly comes down and says that sometimes. At some point, we're going to downsize, and I just won't have the room available. So she looks at the stuff and she says, "What are you going to do when we don't have the room for all of this?" Well,
all of our wives say that. You should know.
Yeah, it's quite understandable. I'm looking at my oscilloscope is an essential keeper.
Mm-hmm. What is it?
I have actually, my mainstay is an old Tektronix. Can't quite read it from here. I can almost see it. I can't read it, but it's a 2-channel. Like
the 465?
That's it. That's a 465M. And that thing, even though I have a digital scope, I really use the analog one here, the Tektronix, most often. It's been with me like forever. It's been repaired a couple of times, and it's very popular and does everything I need. Even though it's big, but that's okay.
Next two pieces?
Next two pieces is
make and model.
Make and model. Actually, again, I'm into my test equipment is old stuff, and I get it working. So it's definitely not something you can go out and buy necessarily right now. The signal generator, I don't know if I can see that now, is the 8640B. HP 8640B is a very popular but very good signal generator. And again, coming back to my frequency thing, if being able to generate the right frequency at the right level is of extreme value to me as a designer, because it helps me validate the designs, it helps me test and prove out new concepts, and that is in use all the time. And I like that a lot, actually. A power meter is probably a good power meter, an accurate power meter, is probably the third piece of equipment that are keepers. I happen to use it's a black box power meter. Can I read this one now? This is the KA7EXM power meter from Kanga, US. Bill Kelsey kitted it up for the Hayward fellow. I can't remember his name. Not Wes, but his brother. Do I have that right? Anyways, KA7EXM. And this was in QEX a while back. The design was. And I built that kit, and it has been with me forever, it seems. And it's just a very accurate power meter. Down at QRP levels, it's kind of important to know if you're at 5 watts or 4.2. I mean, it matters a lot. And you can't do that as easily with some of the inline power meters that we use for SWR and such. So that thing is, again, frequencies and power matter. So that's why that's in my stable of essentials.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. I found a presentation online that you made called the Midnight Loop Antenna, and it appears that you're using a 2-inch strip of metal to make a magnetic loop antenna versus using a heavy coax or tubing, aluminum tubing or copper tubing. How does your Midnight Loop? How is it different from a regular magnetic loop antenna, similar to the Alex loop?
Oh, it's quite different in a couple of ways. First of all, it was 10 inches long, either 8 or 10 inches wide strip of aluminum flashing, not 2 inches. And I point that out because the main thing, again, coming back to my interactions over the years with Joe is fascinated with antennas, and he's always exploring different facets of them and ways to make them better. And we both say that if you can't measure it, it ain't true. So many, just as an aside, so many people, so many hams say, I put up this antenna or I built this little transmitter and it works great. I contacted Japan. And that's a nice thing to be able to say. It's not too quantitative. So being able to measure the performance of an antenna, being able to optimize its performance relative to the factors that are important is something that was of great interest to Joe and me. So we set out on it was a design activity, or actually started off as an investigation, and the Midnight Loop was the result of that prototyping experimentation, was to focus on loop antennas, small transmitting loop antennas, which have become really quite popular in recent years. We did that back, I forgot what the date was, 2008, 2010, and presented it at the Massachusetts Convention, MassCon or something. But we looked at the loop principles of operation, and just in quick summary, I mean, the more surface area that you have on the loop itself, the greater the efficiency is going to be. So we said, instead of taking that whatever, like a 1-inch diameter copper tube or 1-inch a piece of RG8 and creating a loop from it, that doesn't present as much surface area as maybe a large sheet of aluminum. So we took that 8 or 10-inch width sheet of aluminum, we wrapped it around in a loop. We connected the two ends by means of a capacitor, and we tried to optimize every aspect of that loop's operation in order to see the kind of performance that could be achieved. And performance, again, can be measured by field radiation, field strength measurements, which are some tests, extensive tests that we did and documented, and also by carefully designing the capacitor and having as low a resistance in that loop as possible. All of that via the equations points to having a higher efficiency. Now, the whole experiment of the midnight loop turned out to be pretty good, except for mechanical stability. The answer in our case was not blowing in the wind, to quote an old popular song. When the wind was blowing, it would really change the physical characteristics of the loop, and the resonant point would change dramatically, the Q would change dramatically, and it was just unstable. Actually, right now, though, we are in the process, and again, Joe and myself, and again, back with design collaborator Milt Cram, W8NUE, we are really looking at ways to make a stable loop with great performance. We're using Heliax, 2-inch Heliax hardline, which offers a greater surface area around the circumference of the larger width, larger diameter Heliax than I think you mentioned Alex loop, and there are a couple of others that use coax. So dramatically improving or increasing the surface area, and again using vacuum variables for the capacitance part of the loop. These are things that we're looking at right now. So the midnight loop was all a predecessor, a staging point, an understanding working prototype that got us to this stage now of really creating an optimized performance loop.
No, I haven't seen 2-inch Heliax since I was at a naval transmitting station in San Diego some 40 years ago. Where do you find 2-inch Heliax?
Not very easily. You keep asking around and asking around and asking around, and ultimately I found a ham who is also like a broadcast. He operates as a broadcast engineer up in Pennsylvania, and he says, "Hey, I've got some scrap stuff that if you're interested, you can have it. It's only about 95 feet, but it's pretty good." I said, "Holy cow, 95 feet!"
It'll make a few loops.
It'll make a few loops, and especially we're making multi-turn loops now to again help enhance the efficiency. So I immediately drove all the way up, something like a 3.5-hour drive up to see him, and for a song and a dance, he gave me the scrap, and it was. I broke my back, almost literally, bringing it back. It was just really quite heavy and unwieldy. But it's now sitting in the garage. It's almost come into the form that it's going to be able to be stood up and operational. But you're right. It's not something that we find every day at hamfests. And you just have to keep asking, and eventually you'll find something that works. A lot of other experimtation is being done, too, in aluminum gutter. Hard to realize how that might be done, but take an aluminum gutter, which circumference, although it's irregular, having a circumference of maybe, a diameter, let's say an equivalent diameter maybe of like 4 inches, really offers a lot of surface area too. So if you could construct something in that vein, there's ways to improve it too. So Heliax is not the only solution, although
it's a great solution if you can find it.
If you can find it, yep.
Now you have a very impressive professional resume, which is also available on your QRZ site. But one of the things that you appear to be doing now is that you're working with Life Journey. What is Life Journey, and what role do you play in it?
Oh, well, thank you. Life Journey is an online platform for students to be living a day in the life of a cybersecurity mentor in the field. My expertise is cybersecurity, and Life Journey is a platform that allows students to learn more about that STEM field and ultimately become inspired in it, such that ultimately they can be considering technology and STEM education and ultimately getting into the cybersecurity field when they graduate. The U.S. and the world, much of the world, is just hurting for not having enough STEM students graduating. So this is one effort and one platform that is receiving tremendous accolades and excitement in the education field for its ability to reach students and inspire them and motivate them to be, following cybersecurity as a career.
Well, I think it's a very clever idea, but I remember as a kid that it was the adult hams who were the inspiration for the life's journey. Do you think there's some correlation there?
It's a possibility, but today's ham radio is not necessarily seen as being on the forefront. To us hams, this is almost a sacrilege statement, but it's reality. When students and kids everywhere and adults have the cell phone, and they say, why do I need to have some special radio gadget to talk to somebody when I can talk to anybody over the using a cell phone and text and social media? Well, there is some truth to what that is. It's really quite different from the kind of communications that we're doing, and it's hard to get students or anybody these days necessarily, unless they're really inspired and guided with some element of some sort, to understand the difference and the value of the excitement, the joy that can come about from building your radio and to be operating and sending out a message that says, hey, I'm here and I'm ready to talk. Is anybody out there? And then when you do find somebody that's out there that wants to talk with you, you have common interests by nature of the background, your background, and your common background of buying, using, or building the radios that you're using at the moment. So, yeah, you sometimes start off by talking about the weather, but then it very quickly gravitates toward your antenna. And, hey, we're using the same kind of amplifier. Or, hey, your fist, your Morse code is sounding so good. How do you do it so well? How many years have you been doing that? So it's a lot different than the kind of communications that students would have, the stilted communications that they have with the social media.
How old is Life Journey now, and how many students do you have involved?
Life Journey is 3 or 4 years old now. We have hundreds of thousands of students throughout the U.S. that are using the U.S. version of the product. We have a super partner with the NSA, the National Security Agency. So they're a partner in getting this out to all high schools free of charge, to the teachers, to the students, to have them do this. In Australia, we are introducing several different versions of the product in concert with the Australian government, the education departments there. We've introduced and are operating a version of our product in Singapore, and there are other countries that are currently under development as far as launching the Life Journey product. It's all about inspiring the students and getting them to be excited about same things that you and I were excited about when we started off at ham radio. For me, it was the aspect of, wow, I can actually take two or more pieces of gadgets, resistors, capacitors, and wire, and ultimately use that to contact and talk to somebody else. The principles and understanding of television, of even cell phones and how they work, all of this interest in technology is important to impart to our younger generation, because pretty soon you and I are going to be even older and unable. We're not going to be around forever, and the new generation is going to be here. If they don't have the same kind of interest in technology, in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, as we had, that drove us into the ham radio hobby, who is going to be driving the next generation who's going to be driving the next society to Mars or to electric vehicles, to other forms of high tech that we haven't even dreamed of today. We need that. So this is why Life Journey is important to me. It's why Life Journey and STEM education is so important to teachers everywhere. They need to have the vehicle, the tools in order to connect what you and I do in industry today in a STEM technology-driven way to what's being taught in the high schools. If we can bring life to the courses that are being taught in school, such that students from 8th grade up are able to see the relevance of learning math, the relevance of physics, the relevance of frequency. They'll be able to drive those next innovations that are going to lead us on into the future.
I noticed a guitar in your Ham Radio Shack picture. Are you an active musician?
Oh, you are thorough. I'm not an active musician. Well, how to state it? I've been playing the guitar for 40 years, and I'm still learning. I enjoy it a lot. I find that guitar, music in general, but specifically guitar and the notes and the chords and the sequences mesh well with the way that I think. So my thinking in terms of electronic design and analysis, in terms of the software that goes into the SDR Cube transceiver, the DSP programming, and the music all kind of relate. And it just, it's a different way for me to relax. And it's sitting here in the shack because I just sit back sometimes, and whether I'm overwhelmed or just overtired and it's well past midnight when I'm doing the midnight design stuff, it's easy to pick it up and just kind of strum some things and kind of make develop those calluses on my fingers a little bit more. I can't sing for beans, but I do enjoy the instrumental aspects of acoustic guitar. It's relaxing, and it just helps me think better. I sometimes think of new projects while I'm playing the guitar, strange as that seems.
No, I get it. I've got one, I didn't tell you this, but I have one next to my desk as well. So, that I like to pick up every once in a while just because it kind of rewires the way you're thinking.
Indeed.
Right. What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
Well, there is so much that is happening. I love the development of SDR, software-defined radio, and the performance directions that the Open HD, the Open HPSDR, probably not saying it right, that Flex Radio, there's a couple of others that are spearheading that whole activity. That's really good.
The Tapper stuff.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I love Tapper, and longtime member, and they have great projects, and it's a great team there. I enjoy working with them. They've helped me in a couple of my projects, and I'm very grateful for that all the way along. The other area I wish I were, and I've always kind of earmarked to be getting into is, and it's an area that I think that ham radio guys have to be going more, is up in frequency. Again, back to frequency. Higher frequency space is much more the future, I think, of our of society's use of radio spectrum, and it offers us a lot more room to experiment and develop new techniques in ham radio in that space, microwaves. So I kind of a back burner type of thing. I belong to various the microwave societies and the groups, and I follow the lists and such. I've even tried a little bit of experimentation in that area myself. It's really quite different than HF work, although its frequencies, it's just really, really small frequencies, small wavelengths. So it requires some new skills and different techniques for home brewing and construction that's kind of my goal, to be working toward that direction. But I think that's an important future direction of ham radio, is going up.
George, what advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Don't be afraid to get to put a soldering iron in one hand and a side cutters in another hand, and really experiment with the circuits. I'm not talking about buying a $1,000 radio and getting in there with your soldering iron. What I'm saying is experiment with the basics and the principles of ham radio to understand them better. Most anybody can go buy a handheld, an HT, handheld walkie-talkie radio to talk over a repeater. It doesn't keep their interest as long as a truer, deeper understanding of the radio principles, of electronics, and even software that makes today's radios tick. So understanding radio at a deeper level would be a very fulfilling direction for returning hams and even new hams. Once the novelty of actually making that first communication, as we always do, as I did back with my Elmer back in Tonawanda, New York, on a two-tube transmitter, and the thrill of having somebody come back to you and say, "Hey, I heard you," and that nothing can beat that, and that's always the first step. But I'm talking about the next steps. After that thrill kind of wears off a little bit, what's next? I'm suggesting that what's next can be actually playing with the electronics and developing your own skill set to be understanding those principles in order to better use all of the things that you learned in your license when you gained your license: resonance, impedance, what is important in antenna feed lines. Just understanding more about your radio is a greatly satisfying aspect to me about being a ham radio operator over the years, much more so than being able to just push a button and talk to somebody. Having an understanding of your station operation, and it provides a lifelong direction, a fertile, lifelong valley of exploration, of discovery, of pleasure that you as a technician, a technical individual, have before you if you wish to take advantage of that.
Well, along that vein then, would you recommend kit building? And if so, what kit would you recommend as a first kit for somebody just getting in?
Oh, definitely. Kit building is super important. Kit building is a really great way to follow the direction that I was saying. Nobody's going to all of a sudden out of the blue, without any prior experience, solder together some resistors, capacitors, and inductors and make yourself an oscillator, or even more, a transmitter. You have to build up to it, pun intended. I think what you're suggesting is a great way. And buying kits is, a proven design, and it's a cookbook. Put it together and get it working, which is also a great thrill when it first works. The same thrill as you had with that first contact. And being able to step back and say, wow, I built that, and it's actually doing what it's supposed to do. None of my friends can do that. And this is something I could show at a science fair, or I could show to my parents and my buddies and whatever. As far as what kits, that's...
Yeah, what would be the first kit you would recommend to a new ham? Will you start with a soft rock?
A soft rock is a great way to start. I was going to say start off with a very simple direct conversion radio. Actually, I wouldn't start with a soft rock. You can, because it requires a computer. And once the computer is set up, you just plug your soft rock into the computer, and then you have an operational radio. Other ways are to build kits that are based around a direct conversion receiver design, as a soft rock is, but it's on a self-contained circuit board. We featured an SW30 in one of our recent Chat with the Designer episodes, a series of those episodes. It's maybe a 3x4-inch circuit board full of axial lead components, no surface mount, that one can assemble. It's a proven design from really great designer Dave Benson, K1SWL. He's now in retirement, but over the years, he and his company, Small Wonder Labs, produced amazing kits right along this line. So even though that SW30 is no longer available, there are others that are like it, available within the community, within eBay. For example, I'm thinking, and very inexpensively, there is, I've forgotten the name of it now, but it's a popular 40-meter, 7.034 megahertz.
That's the Pixie. That's the transmitter you're talking about, or are you talking about the Asher Farhan's View 2 ESC's BidX?
The BidX is a great way, is one of the ways. I wasn't thinking of that because I think that's a little bit a bigger project.
Right. A little complicated for a first-time kit.
It is. So I was thinking of the $14, might have been the Pixie transmitter. And you put it together, and it you can get on the air, but just with Morse code, which is a great first starter. Again, seeing something work that way. You couple that with your receiver, that maybe an older receiver that you buy at a Hamfest, or a simple shortwave receiver that has the ability to receive CW, and you're pretty good. I think that's the best way to go in building a kit.
George, I want to thank you so much for joining me on QSO today. It's been very interesting for me, and I hope that you enjoyed it as well.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I hope this is of interest to your audience. I really enjoy your podcast, QSO Today. There is some really good material out there like this, like QSO Today, like Solder Smoke, and a self-plug at the Chat with the Designer podcasts. There are others, too. It's fun to explore. It's fun to... I am still learning today, and anytime that I pick up an issue of QST, QEX, ER magazine, or listen to these podcasts that we're talking about, it's a way for me to continually expand my own horizon, and I hope that it's that way with others too. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, George. 73.
73 to you. Bye-bye.
And that concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with George. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information to the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in N2APB in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.